Welcome to Social Aloe Ministries, where we are committed to glorifying God while exposing the devil. The following message may come across as being harsh, and some of you may think that I am not being very Christ-like. But I just want to remind you, John the Baptist, when he saw the Pharisees and Sadducees, he called them a generation of vipers. That didn't sound very Christ-like, but then Christ came along. On several occasions, he called the Pharisees and Sadducees a generation of vipers. I don't think I'm going to be calling any names, but the following message may come across as being harsh, but it is a dose of reality. And it is up to you and the Lord, regarding how long you take to listen to this message, what you do with it. And basically it's about getting off the treadmill and either taking a hike or hitting the road. And yes, when I mention about taking a hike and hitting the road, those are also metaphors for getting lost or going away. So when I say harsh message, but it is a dose of reality. If you are actually working out on a treadmill, it doesn't matter how much time and effort you put in. At the end of it, even if you're drenched with sweat, dying of thirst, you're still going to be in the same spot. And too many of you are in the same spot, exerting time and effort, going nowhere, simply because you need to get off the treadmill of life and hitting the road or taking a hike. Somewhere where your efforts is moving you forward, where you're making progress, where there's truly something to show for it, as opposed to remaining in the same spot. The Lord promised the nation of Israel the promised land. However, because of their lack of faith, the Lord said the generation, basically age 20 years and older, would not enter into the promised land, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua. And as a result of that, everyone except for those two, they spent years wandering in the wilderness, basically going around in circles. So in a sense, they were on life's treadmill, and they were not going to reach the promise. It didn't matter how hard they worked. It didn't matter how long they persisted. They were not going to enter into the promised land, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua. And that's part of the issue. Many of you are chasing the wrong goals. And it doesn't matter how hard you work, you're not going to get there. And this is why you truly have to be Holy Spirit led. Because a lot of times, people make emotional decisions. And it's not even the devil who misled them. They mislead themselves. And they keep on pursuing something that they are never going to get. And even if they get it, it is only going to last for a brief while, because they will not be able to retain it. And one of the things is, the Lord is not obligated to sustain what he does not ordain. And I'm going to show you an example of someone who spent years on a treadmill, years on life's treadmill, going after something that she never got. And it's going to be in the book of Genesis. And we have caught on, I'm going to be speaking about Leah. But not just Leah, Jacob, and Rachel, because there are some issues there. In Genesis 29, Jacob met up with Laban, a family member. Jacob started working for Laban, and Laban said that he shouldn't work for him for free. And they made an agreement that Jacob would work for 7 years in order to marry his younger daughter, Rachel, a woman he loved. That's an example of taking a hike, of hitting the road. It was a goal that Jacob knew, that at the end of 7 years, he would be able to marry Rachel. They made an agreement. However, Laban, a child of the devil, deceived Jacob and caused him to marry his older daughter, Leah, a woman he didn't love. Jacob woke up the following morning mortified when he discovered that he had been deceived. But he had been, in a sense, locked in a marriage. I'm not sure if they had any recourse at that time. Like nowadays, if a person ends up in a fraudulent marriage, they can file for annulment or divorce. But I don't think I'm going to be going there in this presentation. But if something were to happen like that in today's days, could file for a divorce or annulment based on fraud, because that's what it was, fraud, for Leah and Jacob to get married. But I'll pick it up in verse 30. And one note is that both times when Jacob got married, Laban gave a handmaid to his daughters, and those handmaids ended up becoming Jacob's concubine. Some of you may be thinking, hey, Jacob made out pretty well. He wanted to marry Rachel and he ended up with 4 women. No. Jacob loved Rachel. And I'm willing to venture that all he desired was Rachel, and he couldn't care less about others. And actually there's evidence of that. But starting in verse 30 of Genesis 29. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah. He loved also Rachel more than Leah. But hold on. And served with him yet 7 other years. And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated. So now we get a bit of clarification. Jacob never loved Leah to begin with, before they were married, and getting married didn't change that. And he opened her womb. So again, and the Lord saw that Leah was hated, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And stopping right there, you may be thinking, well, even though Leah deceived Jacob into marrying her, the Lord opened her womb so that she'd be able to conceive, and Rachel was barren. So that must mean that the Lord was blessing Leah more than Rachel. Don't make those assumptions. And I know there are people out there who believe that if they can deceive someone into a relationship, then the Lord is going to bless it towards the end. And it may not go like those individuals think. Like I say, if the Lord is not obligated to sustain what he didn't ordain. In a lot of cases, that's probably part of the reason why the divorce rate among Christians is just as high as in secular society. People trying to put relationships together as opposed to letting God do it. So it continues. And Leah conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. Leah was on the treadmill. So the Lord blessed her with a child, and she was thinking that that was going to draw her husband to her. That's also another thing. And sometimes in relationships, people think that by having a child, that is going to draw them closer together. And the opposite may end up being true. In some cases, having a child is actually a method of entrapping an individual to try to stay in that relationship even longer. That may not work. That may not work. And one more thing to add about that. When a child is brought into a relationship on those circumstances, that child ends up becoming a pawn. And oftentimes, if a couple ends up parting ways, that child ends up becoming a pawn to cause affliction to the person who leaves. It is simply ugly to try to trap someone into a relationship. And she conceived again and bare a son, and said, because the Lord hath heard that I was hated. So another child, so we're talking about 2 years now. Jacob still hated her. I know the people out there, as long as they're in that relationship, they don't truly care how the other person feels. at least, and I'll give Leah a little bit of credit in that she was trying to earn her husband's love. And I use the term husband loosely because I have an issue with how Leah went about getting Jacob to marry her. So, because the Lord hath heard that I was hated, he hath therefore given me this son also. She called his name Simeon. And she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, Now, this time will my husband be joined unto me. Now, this time will my husband be joined unto me. And I'll pause for a second. Now, we know about people getting married and becoming one flesh. It is not as simple as that. Because there are times when people are sexually intimate, and depending on the circumstances, both people may be sexually intimate, but there is no actual bonding taking place. In other cases, one person may cleave and the other person may not bond. And with this, it's like Leah wanted the Lord to draw Jacob closer to her. What Leah was doing, she was having children, helping to give birth to the nation of Israel, but she was not drawing her husband closer to her. So again, now, this time will my husband be joined unto me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore was his name called Levi. And she conceived again, and bare a son. And she said, Now will I praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah, and left bearing. Now the name Judah, you may think, wow, Judah. That is the tribe from which Jesus descended, because he's known as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. But is that causing Jacob to get closer to Leah? A lot of times why relationships fall apart is based on how they started. Is it possible that if Jacob knew that he was going into a marriage with Leah, that he could have fallen in love with her? It's possible. However, there was no love at the beginning. And when there was no love at the beginning, chances are there won't be any love any point after that. So please don't fool yourself into thinking that your qualities are so great that if someone gets to know you, that he or she is going to fall in love with you. The Lord will bring you down low. He will humble you if that is your opinion. Now continuing into the 30th chapter. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister. So because of the messy start, there's going to be mess in that relationship. And said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, Behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. When she mentioned about bearing on her knees, that kind of surrogate pregnancy is actually something where that concubine, the handmaid, and that's what I've heard, is that that concubine would actually sit between the knees of the wife to simulate as if it was a wife giving birth, but it's coming through the concubine. So when she mentioned about through her knees, it is actually meaning that on the day of childbirth, that she would sit down, the concubine would be between her knees, giving birth, as a symbol that the child was actually Rachel's in this case. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid to wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. I can imagine that being hard to deal with, where Rachel couldn't conceive a child. Jacob ends up having sex with Bilhah, and she gets pregnant. And we see something similar to where Sarah influenced Abraham to have a child with Hagar, and how they were successful. But that was not God's will. But at least in this case, the Lord was using these women to start the nation of Israel. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. By the way, this is the 5th child. So we're looking at about 5 years since Jacob married both these women. And there's a reason why I'm giving you the time frame. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and have I prevailed. She called his name Naphtali. Rachel's life would not be so tumultuous if she had been able to marry the man that she was engaged to for 7 years, and her sister had stayed out of it. But because her sister got into it, they were wrestling with each other. Even though Jacob did not love Leah, and Rachel had his heart, but simply her being around, it caused problems. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah said, a troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. So at Asher, that's child number 8. So we're looking around 8 years into the marriage. And it begs the question, has Leah gotten off the treadmill, or is she still trying to get Jacob to love her? Are all these children, are all her efforts working out for her? And Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field. And by the way, mandrakes are said to have aphrodisiac properties. In addition, it has hallucinogenic properties. So who knows? Maybe part of the reason why Jacob ended up marrying Leah and didn't know until the following day, maybe they slipped some mandrake into his drinks. Which, by the way, some people will resort to witchcraft in order to lure someone into a relationship. The manipulation that Laban and Leah exercised over Jacob, that counts as witchcraft. Regardless how they did it, that was witchcraft. Then Rachel said to Leah, give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. So Rachel said to Leah, give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. And she, Leah, said to her, is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? I kind of wish I had sound effects for scratched records. Because the thing is, Jacob and Rachel were married for 7 years. Jacob had no desire for Leah. But because she was able to get her hands on him first, and yes, they were legally married, but she's talking about her husband. as if Rachel had, quote unquote, stolen her man. When for all those years, Jacob's heart belonged to Rachel, not Leah. And wouldst thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. Let me continue for a second. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. And I kind of laugh because I can imagine Jacob being out in the field, thinking about coming home and how he's going to be with Rachel that night. And then Leah comes up again. And I say again because that's what she did on the wedding night. Leah comes up again. And then he has to go in onto her. Which brings me another thing. There is a difference between running on a treadmill and running on the road. And I'm not going to get too crude, so to speak. But since Jacob did not have feelings, since Jacob did not love Leah, then it's fair to assume that their sexual relations were different than him being with Rachel. It is hard to make love to someone that you don't love. I'll say it again. It is hard to make love to someone who you don't love. It ends up being just sex. And even in the context of marriage, this is bad because I'll just say that's bad. It is actually sad that Leah had to live that way. And God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived and bare Jacob the 5th son. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I have given my maiden to my husband. She called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and bare Jacob the 6th son. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. And this next statement speaks volumes. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun. Zebulun is Jacob's 10th child. So we're looking at a time frame of around 10 years. 10 years into the marriage. And Jacob still had not cleaved unto Leah. 10 years. 10 years into the marriage, and they still had not cleaved. I say it again. The Lord is not obligated to sustain what he does not ordain. I have never heard of the Lord bringing two people together. And I'll just say in modern times, I've never heard of the Lord bringing two people together and they did not have a spiritual attraction towards each other. And I'll say this, and it will save a lot of people heartache. If you are not spiritually attracted to the person who's trying to enter into your life, that is not of God. It's possible to have chemistry with a lot of people. You may have a physical attraction. But one of the things that give you that godly peace about a person, peace that transcends human understanding, is a spiritual attraction, a spiritual connection. And even the Apostle Paul mentioned about basically becoming one flesh with a prostitute. Becoming one flesh with a prostitute because of a physical act. But even with that, there is no true cleaving. Yes, it can form what is called a soul tie. which can be broken, praying and asking the Lord to break that spiritual connection between you and the person. The person may still have some feelings for you, but at least on your end, it will be broken. So it is sad, at least 10 years into the relationship, because there was no love at the beginning, still Jacob did not cleave to Leah. So Leah had spent at least 10 years running on a treadmill, pursuing a goal she never achieved. And afterwards, she bare a daughter and called her name Dinah. And God remembered Rachel and hearkened to her and opened her womb. So if you're thinking that because Rachel wasn't having any children, that the Lord did not bless that marriage, because also look in 1 Samuel. Samuel's mother, her name was Hannah. She was in a marriage where her husband had another wife. That wife had children. She used to mock Hannah. Hannah didn't have any children, but the Lord blessed her with Samuel, and the Lord ended up blessing her with a total of 6 children. So you can't make assumptions based on when the Lord may bless a person regarding how he feels about a relationship. So again, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. And a part of the reason why I went down all the way to speaking about the Lord blessing Rachel with Jacob, Rachel with Joseph, is because throughout the years, Jacob demonstrated that he truly didn't love Leah. When he was about to reunite with his brother Esau, his life was in jeopardy, or so he thought. He put the 2 handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah, and their children at the very beginning, followed by Leah and her children. And the ones that were closest to him were Rachel and Joseph. And you can find it in Genesis 33. And that kind of shows, or it showed, the hierarchy regarding how Jacob felt about his, I'll just say, spouses and children. And then in Genesis 37, many years later, it gives you an example of how Jacob felt about Rachel in comparison to Leah. In Genesis 37 verse 3 it states, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. So Jacob gave Joseph a coat of many colors. It talks about Joseph being a son of his old years, or his old age. And that may make you think that Joseph was Jacob's last son. However, in Genesis 35, Rachel gave birth to Benjamin. That was Jacob's last son. What Genesis Psalm 37:3 is telling you is that even though Joseph was the 12th child and the 11th son, Jacob actually saw Joseph as if he was the firstborn son. So even though Leah and the handmaidens, they had all those children, because of Jacob's love for Rachel, he viewed Joseph as his firstborn son. So Leah spent all those years running on a treadmill, pursuing a goal she would never achieve. And one of the sad things about that is when Rachel was giving birth, or shortly after giving birth to Benjamin, Rachel passed away. And that's nothing. Some people have the erroneous belief that if they could only get rid of the competition, then that would cause maybe, for example, someone to fall in love with them. No. No. In some cases, and I can speak for myself, I would much rather do without. I would much rather do without than to settle for something the Lord did not ordain for me. Because a part of that is, it frees that other thing or that other person to be where the Lord wants him or her to be. Or it frees the other person or frees that thing to fulfill their destiny and not to keep on running around on a treadmill. And it speaks to another thing. If you are about to enter into a relationship, you may have that physical attraction or something else may be pulling you into that relationship. As soon as you realize that it is not of God, get out. Set each other free. If not, one or both of you is going to end up becoming a messenger of Satan, interfering with the Lord's plans for each other's lives. But even though I mentioned about relationships, this is not only about relationships. It is truly about learning to identify when you're on a treadmill, so to speak, where you're pursuing something that you're not meant to have, and doesn't matter how much time and effort you put into getting that thing, reaching that goal, that objective. Either you're not going to get there, or if you get there, you won't be able to keep it, and even if you keep it, it won't be fun because it was never yours. The Lord did not ordain it. You have to realize those distinctions between when the Lord has you in a holding pattern, so to speak, where he's going to give something to you after a while, versus you're never going to get it. When I mentioned about the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, the Lord had told Moses that those who are 20 years or older would not enter into the promised land, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. So everyone else was basically running around on a treadmill, close to the promised land, but they would never step foot in there. Some of you are wandering in the wilderness, but you're not going to go into the promised land because that is not your promised land. When Jacob was engaged to Rachel, he knew that at the end of 7 years, he would be able to marry her, or at least based on the agreement. So you had to make the distinction between you being like an Israelite, wandering in the wilderness, where you're basically going, if you stay there, you're going to die. Your dream is going to die. So you have to know whether you're like an Israelite, wandering in the wilderness, but you'll never enter into the promised land, or if you're like Jacob, where after a season, you are going to reap the promise. So I'm going to close out like I started off. Get off the treadmill and either hit the road or take a hike. And may the Lord light the path to tell you where you need to go.